All right. Welcome, everyone. It's October 24th, 23, and we're in our first discussion of Chapter 3 for Cohort 5. So before we go to any specific question, does anyone just want to give any first thoughts or reflections on 3? Just where it is in the textbook, or what stuck with them, or what they remember from the journey? Ollie, want to give any first thoughts, or anyone else?
Yeah, sure. Well, chapter 3, as opposed to chapter 2's kind of bottom-up approach or the low road, takes the more daunting, or let's put it this way, the more adventurous route of the high road, which is the one that's been increasingly developed in the recent years. So it begins with the notion of what it is, or let me put it this way: if we suppose that quote unquote things exist in an environment or in the world at large, what characteristics should they possess to consider them as ontological things? In other words, what characteristics should they possess if we want to kind of reevaluate or remeasure them at a specific time scale and consider them as consistently the same thing? So the idea is, if we put a kind of statistical boundary between the internal states of that object or the thing and its external states or its environment, then it would be possible to underwrite the dynamics of the internal states of the system at face of the changing environment, given that Markov blanket or the statistical boundary. So, in other words, the internal states of the system does not change directly in a response to the changing environment, but the relationship between those two states are kind of vicariously influence the external states vicariously influence the internal states, so they don't have direct access, but only through the blanket states or Markov blanket. So that's basically the idea for a self-organized object, and it's one of the main properties for any living thing, or rather an idea for how life works. I mean, by life here, I mean in a very broad term, and not just necessarily biological life, but it also encompasses any kind of artificial life as well, such as xenobots as developed by Michael Levin's lab, or any other organoids or similar entities that's been increasingly appearing in many various disciplines and research areas.
Thank you. That's a great summary. Christoph, then anyone else who raises their hands?
I just wanted to ask, because the concept of Markov blanket as sort of a separation between the internal and external environment, it always makes me think, isn't it really kind of talking about temporal separation? That ultimately what it really says, that we have states that we can identify that are not directly influenced by the environment, but ultimately the system is it is connected. So it's this separation, like eventually breaks down, right? The signal gets through the barrier and finally influences the internal states.
There's a lot of pieces there. First to the last piece. Yes, the signals do get through, they do influence. So there's causal propagation that can reify the blanket. So blankets can exist as interfaces. They do exist as the interface. they also only exist over a certain spatial or temporal time scale. And then you, in the beginning, described like time in a Markovian sense, and that's like a more common usage of the Markovian property is through time. Like the past only influences the future through the present. So then the current moment is a Markov blanket in time. So you could make a Markov blanket around any Bayes graph. You write the Bayes graph out, you pick the node as internal. That's the system of interest internal states. There is a Bayes graph. There is a Markov blanket. So that could be through time. You could have one variable through time and talk about Markovian property through time. It could be spatially embedded. And then it could refer to spatial temporal enclosure. But the concept does relatively little abstract philosophical work, because by the time you define the Bayesian graph, it's basically trivial or deflationary where the blankets are. And yet it has attracted some of the most heated philosophical discussion. Yeah, go ahead, Rodmore.
So I want to try to connect the formal definition of the Markov blanket, as we're using it in this context, with what we humans seem to have, and maybe probably other animals as well, which is some intuitive notion of what it is to be a thing, because we look at our environment, and maybe some of it corresponds to these partitions that can be defined as Markov blankets. But we maybe see an animal, we see some system, and we identify this collection of entities or of properties. This corresponds to one thing. And of course, we can look at it more closely and start to see more individual things inside of that collective. But well, we do have some notion of thingness that's quite very intuitive. And to follow up on that is I want to understand what kinds of systems we can reasonably describe through the idea of a Markov blanket. To give an example, I've heard Karl Friston talk about setting a drop of ink inside maybe like some water, a cup of water, and the dynamics of that ink drop not being describable or being describable with the Markov blankets. Perhaps the fact that the ink disperses and doesn't maintain its coherence is what he means, is what he's trying to point out. Like that means this isn't showing that property of thingness and of remeasuring that we see when we think about a thing. So yeah, I want to get a sense for what kinds of systems, whether they're biological or not, is it reasonable to describe using the idea of a Markov blanket?
Yeah. Does anyone have a hand raised, just want to speak directly to it? Otherwise, just keep it up and then we'll get to another topic. But first, just what can you model appropriately with the Markov blanket? If anyone just wants to go for it.
My understanding is that it's basically anything, right? Because if it didn't have that separation between itself and the environment, there wouldn't be a distinction between the environment and the thing itself. The example of the drop of ink is one that I actually really like, because it shows that a drop of ink will dissipate inevitably. But if it was a living drop of ink, used as a single cell, yes, it would be a constant state of dissipation, but also the cell is able to extract quote unquote energy from the surroundings, right? By breaking down some molecules in the surroundings, and using that energy to hold itself together, and also to use the byproducts to make more components of itself, so it kind of counters this dispersion over time. Imagining that process to me is, you know, I'm a biologist and so on, but it's still very, very hard. One example I really like is this bottle I have here. Oh, my background is a little blurred. But if I press this button here in this shaker, I make a little vortex, right? And it's kind of cool because like it's making something out of nothing. It's like you have just the environment and you have an input of energy that makes a lower entropy system, right? That demarcates itself from its environment, which is made of the same thing as this thing. And all you need is a battery dissipating a gradient, right? If you don't have the gradient, you have no little vortex. And one thing on that note that I don't know if somebody has an answer is what is a Markov? Does this thing have a Markov blanket just like a flame? And if it does, well, it has to, right? Because it's a thing separated from other things. What is the? Can we classify different kinds of Markov blankets? You know, like this is very transient. It's very thin. It's but that membrane, the membrane of a cell, is a much more complicated blanket.
Many points. Just to very briefly note them, because it's always more time in between our discussions. Like, yes, it is about the cell and the ink. Here's one of the earliest 2006 examples. There's a snowflake. So snowflakes are getting whipped around like your vortex. External energy is going through so what can you say about a snowflake? Well, it's frozen. But what could you say if there were some snowflakes that also could preclude melting? So that's why it has to start with a thing, and a lot falls out from you starting with a persistent thing or a remeasured thing. Does a thing have a Markov blanket? This is the eternal realist instrumentalist question. The realist language is, yes, it has a Markov blanket. Cells do active inference. This organism has a precision estimate. The instrumentalist position is you can model it with a Markov blanket. It's as if it has a precision variable. And so whether we say that it's about what the territory is doing, about what it has or is, versus what we could do, classifying different kinds, yes, absolutely. Transient watering blankets, these are the kinds of things that many people are researching about, because when you actually do have a system of interest, these kinds of questions are just immediately the things that you need to ask. Jesse? Yeah, go ahead, David, sorry. Okay, Jesse.
May I just interject for a moment to add another angle?
Yeah, sure.
For this? Yeah. Okay, so another perspective for viewing Markup blanket. I mean, whether or not it is ubiquitous or just it only applies to specific things, is that okay? So theoretically, it is possible to draw some statistical boundary between anything that is sufficiently separated from its environment. But for the things that follow or that have kind of linear causal structure to their dynamics or to their interactions with the environment, this Markup blanket doesn't say anything specifically interesting about the dynamics. So the significance of Markup blanket it becomes more apparent when we're dealing with the systems with nonlinear causal structures to their interactions with the environment. So the more nonlinear their dynamics, the more interesting things Markup blanket can say about the interaction of that system, and it can somehow result in non-trivial elements of the description of the system. So as Dalton Stack-Vadivell has shown in one of his papers, Weak Blankets, it's not I mean, the question of Markov blanket, it's not a question of whether or not, but it's a question of degree. So we can have a continuum of blanketedness, if you will, of different different degrees of strength for that Markov blanket. So again, for linear systems, we have very trivial kind of Markov blankets. And as the system gets more complicated or more complex and with higher dimensional structure, Markov blankets become increasingly non-trivial.
Thank you, Ollie. Jesse, and then Susan.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying, Ali, because I mean, the way that I've been viewing the Markov blanket is I know that there is, I guess, a temptation to extrapolate like a broader meaning about existence and thingness, but I'm just kind of looking at it as a statistical tool to, delimit inputs. And right, it's like, it's a way of organizing inputs and defining external states and internal states, because in the things as they are, the number of variables of inputs is really difficult to, quantify in that broad causal chain. And so that's maybe where, Ali, that what you're saying about the nonlinearity is really interesting. But in model making, where we are like investigating specific input output relationships, the Markov blanket seems to be very useful for us to be able to, create that type of Bayesian graph and organize that information.
Great. Yeah, and also like blanket only exists as part of the particular partition in relation to the rest that are being described. So it's not like a blanket drawing exercise. It's like a system modeling exercise, and then taking different system of interest as your internal state. You just, by definition, get a Markov blanket. So hence, it does little philosophical work by itself, and yet has attracted some of the most attention. Susan?
So, so aren't blankets isn't there blankets versus blanket? In other words, there's different scales, and when you say partition, that that kind of maybe when you say partition, are you talking about Markov blankets at different levels? And to to kind of tie on to what Jesse was saying, aren't Markov blankets context specific?
Okay, a lot there. Let's think about a few more tangible pieces. First, here's the definition. So we're talking about the relationships of variables, not about the relationships of things in the world. So any discussion of what a Markov blanket is/does as the technical concept, it's not going to be supported or rejected by any feature of the world. It's about the variables being related. And then the partition is just the definition of what the Markov blanket is doing, which is a set of nodes, one or more, that are intervening between two other sets. That comes into play when modeling how variables are connected. So if we made a model of temperature in the room, and there was just one thermometer carrying forward through time, we might have one model where every time point can influence every other time point. But then for long time series, that's going to get out of control. So a common modeling assumption is like, well, make it a Markov chain, a one Markov chain, where only the last time step influences the next time step. So that was what was mentioned earlier. Like that's a pure Markov blanket in time. Is that a claim that there isn't like time effects in the real world? Well, not specifically, but then you could at least use that and say, actually, we're finding that the one Markov chain model captures pretty much all the empirical phenomena. So still, that's not saying that there aren't some time effects in some setting, but it's just saying that it's totally sufficient for that case.
So one more question that for me ties it up is that when you say Markov chain versus the model, I'm kind of relating a Markov chain to a map.
Yeah, I think you can even go further. The whole thing is a map. We're only talking about cognitive cartography, only map. And then the Markov chain is this motif where you have a set of chained states, hidden states through time, with a Markov transition matrix, B. That's the one Markov property, is that horizontal chain. And so like you could have a probability matrix that is like on the diagonal, it has things staying the same. Sunny to sunny, 0.9, and then cloudy to cloudy, 0.9. And then the off diagonals is like the transition between them. So those are some simple statistical models of dynamic systems. And a Markov chain is when they're just chained forward in time. The Markov blanket could be considered from a static perspective. Again, that's not to say like organisms are or aren't dynamic. It's just about the Markov blanket. You could have a causal network that is static. It's how Bert, in his work in 55.0 today, introduced the Bayes graph concept, was with a static causal chain. Just kind of contextual factors interacting like a structural equation model, but in a Bayesian setting. And then you can imagine composing a Bayes graph that has a spatial and a temporal component, or a temporal and a perceptual component, or a temporal and a perceptual and an active component. And then when we have a Bayes graph in time with something like perception and action, then that is where we get the partially observable MDP. But like Markov decision process was a term before and outside of this kind of Markov boundary as organism boundary discussion. Markov decision process is just referring to the Markov chain and making decisions on a Markov chain. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it's the heart of the high road, as Ali mentioned, because whether we're from the outside talking about remeasuring something, that's like, so then there's things that are static compared to how we're remeasuring them. There's things that are changing faster than we can remeasure them. So then they're not being detected as the same thing, like gas molecules in a room. But then there's some spot where there is like a temporal thickness in modeling. And then that could be seen from either the remeasurement, the experimental position, which comes back in chapter 9, looking like this. Experimenter observing something, or to persist in time, that can be framed as a remeasurement of homeostatic attractors, rather than, for example, the maximization of a reward or utility function. It's like, well, no, the 0th level task is to remeasure in the homeostatic range, not to be rewarded by values in the homeostatic range and then maximize reward, but to directly target the statistical measurement. Any other topics or quote to a section that somebody wants to like go to? Yeah.
Yeah, just this whole relationship between value and belief. You know, the relationship between the value function and you know, the function of prior beliefs and surprise minimization, I thought was a really interesting jump that I'd love to talk more about or to have some people's thoughts on.
Which page or section, or anyone can just give a thought?
section 3.5. Page 53.
Yeah, very related to the previous discussion. Replaces the notion of value with the notion of prior belief. So you can contrast the sort of imperative to be value, and so the base assertion to be value exists, and then the imperative to be that it has to be optimized or maximized. Alternatively, a sort of foundational assertion can be the thing exists, which might be kind of a neat assertion because we might only be interested in those systems that do fulfill that. And then the imperative would be the kind of more boring and first level, be that thing, whatever it is, be as it is, as and instead of setting up even anticipatory, so that seems to more closely apply to, like, okay, the rock is just sitting there, the bird is just flying, okay, things just kind of do their own thing. But then that's the variational free energy. So then the next question is, well, then how do you actually get snowflakes that fly and resist melting, cells that don't just dissipate like an ink drop? How do you actually get something to both be what it is and have a preference or realize its preference or have agency in realizing its preferences? And that's where the expected free energy comes in. Again, making no assertions about the mechanism that any given system actually does to fly and avoid danger, but giving a statistical framework for the bird watcher so that they can say something statistical about the behavior that they're seeing. And then the other side of the coin is like the mechanistic and the how, and that's the low road. How is the bird or the bat avoiding danger? Well, it's not actually doing matrix multiplication, but it's a whole question to actually investigate how, and that's the low road for each system. But the high road is kind of the starting point for discussion, because without the high road, it's like an admission that it's a purely hypothetical space. And then even that exists in a sense. Inks? And then anyone else?
I just wanted to give an example about this. In my work, often people act against their goal because I was going to say value, but the intrinsic reward for proving their unconscious prior belief, I am the one who suffers, I am the one that everyone hates, somehow the organisms values that higher, this prior belief of identity, I am that thing, than actually achieving a goal that they set for themselves. So to me, intuitively, that makes a lot of sense, that swap there. Because I imagine that has to do with the deep affect that comes with precision, evaluating your prior as good. Like my old systems work, my old priors are valid, so there is a high there around good affect. I may be suffering, I may be losing, but I was right all along. Can't take that away from me.
Yeah, lot to say there. So in the affective inference work, they linked the psychological phenomena of affect to precision estimation. So if things were more variable than expected, that was negative affect. If things were more precise, it was positive affect. And if things were as precise as expected, as variable as expected, it was neutral valence. And so if there's an empirical track record of something being a certain way, like I've gotten out and gotten $1 each day, I'm the kind of person who gets $1, and then now there's an affordance that is empirically not been taken, then there's these different mechanisms to explore, like precision on policy or precision on sensory inputs. Maybe the 3 is like surprising, and so then it's like less cognitive overhead, or just more natural flow to go back into an empirical previous way of doing it. But then multiple models are constructed. It's not just like, well, a toy model was made, and now this is like, people are going to be using this in a clinic. It's like multiple models are iterated in a lot larger and a slower setting over the years, and then more and more is understood about computational psychiatry. Christoph, then anyone else?
I find it interesting to think about this, this effectively functional beliefs as a sort of, this is the meta function that we're trying to optimize. And I often find it that when I talk to people about, for instance, the notion of free will, I like to say that we don't really have free will, because, if you consider really your circumstances very carefully, you will find out after sufficient analysis that there's usually the correct way to act, and it only feels like you have this free will because you're acting under uncertainty and you're making a decision for the first time. So it feels like you're doing something because there is this place, there's this wiggle room. But this really nicely fits with this notion of prior beliefs, that sort of those prior beliefs make you what you are. You are a thing because you have prior beliefs. And I like to use the term aesthetics, because that really determines, kind of the kind of values you're going to pursue, the things that you care about, the things you find beautiful, the things the way you want to be. That's kind of aesthetics, but the process of so you can in some way you can choose that. But the process of how you're going to get to your preferred state, that's predetermined by the physics of reality, right? So that's and that's where the kind of like this tension between having free will, having the wiggle room, having aesthetics that you can choose, having these prior beliefs that you can that you kind of have to. Well, you can choose them. If you learn how, then you get to adjust your precision parameters, right? It's just a matter of practice to get the root access to the mind to be able to do that. And then everything happens as a kind of automatically from that point on, because if you're an energy minimizing agent, you always know what to do next. Find the juiciest pocket of negative entropy, gobble it up, and go about your business.
Yeah. I mean, saying that a thing is or even has priors is the definition of realism. Certainly a stance that people have asserted. But also people can use the same formalism on that exact same system of interest or a different system of interest in support of an instrumentalist claim. So the framework can be used to advance a realist claim, but at least from my perspective, that doesn't make the mathematics an assertion about any specific system or how any specific thing is. It's literally to the exclusion of that we have a general framework. Susan?
So I actually put about 4 questions in the notes. I didn't know if you were going to try to get to the questions.
Should I look at it from here, or should I go to the chapter or cohort 5 questions here?
The questions.
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess specifically, what's
which one or what word to look up to find it?
Affordances.
Okay.
And that kind of actually pulls on both the questions in terms of Inks and Christoph's discussion in terms of can these be learned?
Okay, great. Thank you for adding them. So Ali explains in the intro video at the top of the page, Markov blanket is a boundary in the state space, not necessarily a spatial temporal boundary. came up today as well. What allows the agent to be statistically separated from its boundary as observed through its blanket? So I take it that the blanket is a lens through which the agent observes their environment. Yeah, a lot of ways that could be taken. But yeah, if we kind of associate Y with observation and the chain of perception, yes, the inbound dependencies across the blanket do map to like a lens. And then also it's a great connection, as some will probably see, that actually in the category theory, like the lens, there's probably even a deeper meaning of this too. But so we won't go into it. But short answer, yes. Would this lens be defined by their affordances? So the outgoing dependencies from the blanket, so literally the other side of perception, action, outbound dependencies, the space of the possible actions is defined by affordances. But if the hidden state were a person, then what their affordances would be, the observations of the other person. So these are not tags on the world. It's not like this object is an observation, this object is an action. It's like in this map with this as my internal state, then this dependency can be read as perception or as action. Affordances, according to Gibson, must be learned. Yeah, I mean, there's really two things here. There's kind of like Gibsonology, like what did this specific person think about this word, which I'm always all for. But the short answer is affordance is being used in a slightly different way in active inference, not to refer to the direct agentic perception of an action capacity, but a little bit more from a modeler's perspective as just simply the action capacities, whether or not they're perceived, without making any statement on whether they have to be learned or not. We can model a pendulum with active inference. So obviously the affordance concept doesn't need learning. You can just model it without learning. Does the distinction between active learning and active inference have to do with these affordances? So yeah, this was a distinction that one paper in the Discord mentioned. Short answer here is you could have two agents with the same set of affordances, move up, down, left, right, and then you could set up the parameters differently. So one of them sought to confirm its expectations about sensory. Another one sought to reduce its uncertainty maximally about world states. So those are all the parametric fine tunings, but it doesn't require a difference in affordances, but it might require a difference in how the affordances are being taken. That's how you would know that the behaviors were different at all. You could also make a model where there were different affordances. So that's for situational modeling. And then the question becomes very obvious. Are internal state parameters referring to the edge of the Markov blanket state space? Not exactly. The internal state parameters are everything about the system of interest that isn't the interface. So it's like the shell of the egg is the Markov blanket, and then the inside is the internal states. Because like when you take a photo, you're just going to see the shell. So that's just the outer interface with perception action across the blanket. And then internal state parameters are everything about that thing that isn't the shell. And then together the thing is internal plus blanket, because that's what moves around relative to the environment. Does anyone else have any like kind of other takes on any of these questions? Yeah, Ali, please.
So there's another rather simplified representation of Markov blanket with regards to the probabilistic dependencies of the different states in the Physics of Sentience presentation by Karl Friston. So if you search for this topic in YouTube, there are several different presentations, but around the time 4 minutes or something, you can see a clear representation of Markov blanket, which shows how exactly external states, internal states, sensory states, and active states relate to each other according to their probabilistic dependencies. So I think that can be quite helpful.
Cool. Also, yeah, a lot of other pieces. These are all great questions. And it's one reason why there's such an emphasis on making the generative models, because there is such a difference between the abstract relationships purely within the ActInf ontology, just the sort of conceptual relationships. And then when mapping it to a system of interest, it's kind of like a 90-degree rotation with what you're connecting up, connecting ActInf terms to specific things. And then when this is all accounted for, that's all accounted for, then that's the generative model. But the textbook is describing like the pure relationships with a stream of examples and boxes and kind of just different pieces, different discussions. Another interesting thing is like the high road's describing the imperative, but the low road is there's might be multiple ways to realize it. So just again to separate out how it's being done from why it's being done. Verena, thank you. Go for it.
I have a question, and it might be connecting to Christoph's question of free will. There is a sentence in chapter 3, and I don't know where, I'm so sorry, but what it says is that there is this, when you maximize actually the free energy, where you keep your options open until you have, and I guess, does it mean until I have enough evidence that I can state the belief? And would it be a demonstration of free will? That's my question.
That's a great question. It's kind of cool. It comes up twice in the low road. So kind of as a previously identified pattern of Bayesian statistics, just having nothing to do with modeling cybernetics. And then here, the maximum entropy principle of Jaynes, the imperative to explain things as accurately as possible, but also keep options open. Ollie, do you want to give a thought on this?
Yeah, I think the question of free will related to active inference, you see, because as far as I understand it, active inference is a kind of framework that puts agency at its center stage, right? So the minimal definition of agency for us to endow or confer agency to any system can be put in its most minimal sense in this way. So if there is more than one way to respond to a stimulus, and the other condition would be if the system or the agent has a way to choose among those responses, then we can probably say it has some minimal sense of agency. So in this sense, I believe active inference models or the agents that's modeled with markup blankets and active inference frameworks, they have indeed this kind of minimal agency to them. But if we go a little bit deeper than that and consider the deeper generative models and deeper hierarchies, then we would come across agents with beliefs about their beliefs. And we can, of course, continue that ad infinitum theoretically, so beliefs about beliefs about beliefs and so on. And the more deeper the generative model gets, the more sentient, or let's say probably more conscious the agent will become. But in any case, even for the most simple case of active particles, we can describe agency with regards to these minimal definitions. So I believe active inference and Bayesian mechanics puts agency, or rather free will, as some of its core tenets for describing those systems. So it is written to the core of active inference, this conception of agencies, and it's something that we cannot take for granted, even if that kind of agency is not so-called real agency, but just kind of apparent agency, or in other words, a kind of agency that appears as if the system has. So yeah, I'm not sure how how it addresses the question of whether there is whether or not there is a kind of free will for these kinds of agents, but I think it can be seen as some kind of minimal framework to address these questions as well.
Great. I'll offer another position, which is the maximum entropy principle also applies to gas molecules in the room and the temperature. So I think even in this discussion, we've heard some positive and negative attributions of free will and active inference. But then the question that we can still circle around is, well, what's the relationship between the technical and analytical maximum entropy principle connected to all this other stuff? For example, the constrained maximum entropy principle being dual to the FEP, more recently being found out. But how does any of those principles relate to how somebody mobilizes an account of a certain biological system, for example? That's even a different kind of question. Susan?
Yeah, well, along those lines, I was just reading something about metacognition and some studies done that relate the difference it made when students were actually taught how to think about their beliefs differently and so I think that for me that kind of brings in the belief updating and the learning as part of agency, because even though I have different options, I may I'm assuming that the Markov blanket can also retract depending on my state, and that's kind of hollow out opportunities. I can't see my affordances even though they're there. Would that be am I pulling those threads together correctly, I guess?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Just so we can hear from everybody in the last minutes. Brenna, then Christoph, then Jesse.
And I have another question. It's page 58, the first sentence. Furthermore, active inference is largely coherent with ideomotor theory, which states that action starts with an imaginative process. Has there been some work done what this imaginative process is, or what's part of the process and how it is? Is there any research group? Do you know anyone, or does anyone know about this kind of imaginative process which triggers the action?
That's a great question. I think you'd find that in essentially all prospective ActInf generative models, you could interpret it coherently with ideomotor. Like if you chose to associate policy selection with ideas, and then the policy that gets selected would have arisen from a imaginative compositional process that triggers action. There may also be people working more on the psychological side, but I mean, you can look it up or post in Discord or continue to explore, but I think that it's a cool question and topic.
Because I mean, imaginative process is a process viewed from a human, not really from maybe a cell or something, I guess. I don't know. That's why I was like a bit triggered by that expression. So I wasn't very sure about what it was addressed here. But thank you for the clarity. I will have a look.
Yeah, it's like we come to it from so many different ways. Well, what if a computer program makes new compositions? Is that imaginative? Not, that doesn't need to be the claim that a human process is the same as a computer process, but if they can be modeled with the same formalism, then from an instrumentalist perspective, it's just like saying, well, we could measure a squirrel and a bird with the same meter stick. That makes limited claims about different animals and how similar or different they are. Jesse, and then anyone else.
Yeah, I like the really thinking about that relationship between variational free energy and maximum entropy, sort of in the risk management framework in a way. It's like engaging in this, it isn't just a matter of like prediction error minimization, but also risk managing predictions in a certain respect. So that topic just made me think like that.
Yeah, it would be a risk to over or underfit. If you underfit the distribution, you'd be leaving information out. You wouldn't have as much awareness as you could. If you overfit, it would be fallacious in a different way. So you'd want to be at the right distribution given what you knew.
Yeah, it's an interesting framework.
Totally agreed. Reza, then Christoph.
Hi. So going back to something Jesse raised about section 3.5 and the active inference side, where it begins by describing how behavior results in reinforcement learning versus active inference. I was just thinking from a practical perspective, do you know of any examples where the simple reinforcement learning examples have also been implemented in code to demonstrate how the active inference approach to that would be, like the card poll example, or something
Yeah.
code intangible.
Cool. The code page, you'll find several dozen applications, and especially the work of Alex Shantz, Nor Sajid, Connor Hines, and others, Baron Millage, those tend to directly tackle and juxtapose non-active inference machine learning. And we've had many live streams on the mountain car, the multi-arm bandit, several other kind of classical settings that make the comparison pretty clear. Christoph, and then anyone else with the last word.
Yeah, I just want to say about this, keeping your options open. It always reminds me of this fantastic thing that the inestimable Terence McKenna said in one of his raves, that he was asking this question, like, why us? Why is the mushroom revealing the secrets of the universe to us? And he said, like, well, because I don't believe in anything. I entertain ideas, and I try to apply it definitely in my life. Is that whenever I think I'm convinced that I understand something, that this is true and that is not true, I look back to that and also to the teaching of the Buddha and think to myself, like, no, the answers are never really that simple. That's like the question of free will. Simply might not have a binary answer. It's just as simple as that. It's complicated. It's a process, and we may not be able to determine one way or another because it simply might not be determinable that way. The fact that the syntax permits us to make a statement doesn't mean it's a valid statement to make. So that's keeping your options open. Yeah, that's an important thing to meditate on. Every day. What do I believe? Nothing. I gather evidence for the existence of ideas.
A lot of different perspectives to take. Great times. Well, thank you, everybody. We will come back next week in the earlier time for, it'll be Halloween. Chapter 3, A Spooky Adventure. Okay. Costumes are optional. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
you.
Bye.